A big proportion of the potential output of the coal industry was lost in those years. During the war, we were desperate for more coal, but we couldn't produce it because of the strikes.
Welcome to Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute, hosted by Georgina Downer. Australia is in the middle of an argument about energy, emissions, prices and sovereignty. And in this argument, we tend to conduct it as if coal appeared sometime around the Hawke years, fully formed, already political. Well, the truth is it didn't. Coal is older than the Commonwealth. Captain Cook's Endeavour began life as a coal ship, a collier, and within a decade of British settlement of Australia, coal was being cut from the cliffs at Newcastle, first produced in 1798 and very likely exported almost immediately, possibly as early as 1799, bound for Bengal. From the start then, coal was not only a domestic fuel, it was part of Australia's outward-facing economy, trading into the Indo-Pacific. Now, coal also shaped the country we built at home. It underwrote steel, powered our factories, lit our streets and fed the early grid. It made Newcastle and Wollongong, New South Wales's second and third cities, what they are today. And for much of the 19th century and into the years before the Second World War, coal was the great engine room of industrial conflict in Australia. And the modern story of coal is also a story of Australia's relations with Japan. And in a very real sense, it's a Menzies story. In 1951, just 6 years after the war, Robert Menzies signed a peace treaty with Japan, followed by goodwill visits, and he spent the early 50s making the case to Australians, along with his Trade Minister Blackjack McEwen, that deeper trade ties with Japan were not only possible, but necessary. John McEwen drove the process inside the government, with Cabinet improving informal talks in 1954, and negotiations culminated in the Australia-Japan Treaty on Commerce in 1957. My guest today is Denis Porter, who's former CEO of the New South Wales Mineral Council and the author of a 2-volume history of coal, the Australian story. So today we're going to ask about the history of the coal industry in Australia. What did coal build? What did it cost? And why does its long history tell us about the choices Australia made in the past, today and into the future? Welcome to Afternoon Light, Denis.
Thanks, Georgina. Nice to be with you.
Oh, it's great to have you on Afternoon Light. I love the podcasts we've done in the past on the history of the mining industry. I've done one on the history of Rio Tinto particularly, which is an iron ore story, as well as some bauxite and other minerals. But coal we haven't done before, which makes this podcast particularly special. It's such a controversial commodity these days, and yet it really, in so many respects, was an essential building block to the Australian economy, to our cities, and particularly for New South Wales and Queensland, where your book really focuses on. How would you describe the importance of coal to Australia's national story?
Okay, look, I mean, you've already touched on it in your introduction there, Julia. It's been absolutely essential. I mean, I'll just run through a few other areas that you didn't touch on. I mean, AGL, which is still a company listed on the Australian Stock Exchange, in the 1830s started to produce gas coal, gasifying coal, and that was used initially for street lighting in Sydney. And that spread, of course, to other towns and cities. And later, that gas was used in houses, initially for lighting and heating and cooking and so on. In the 1800s, Australia had a very substantial interstate trade in various commodities, including coal, and we used steamships, so steamships powered by coal to produce the steam and the power. But a lot of the cargo was initially from New South Wales to Melbourne, for example, to produce gas and so on. Queensland, South Australia, some of the big mines there used coal for powering. In the 1860s, the railways, which had been using timber for their boilers, started to switch to coal. And that use of coal continued in Australia right through to the 1950s and 1960s when diesel power came in and we had diesel locos and coal was phased out over a fairly short period of time. In the 1800s, we had all sorts of factories and foundries which used coal for steam power, for machinery, for heat for the foundries. The big mines and the big smelters used coal. from the late 1890s and into the 1900s particularly, the growth of the electricity industry, and you probably want to touch on that in more detail later. From 1915, when we had the first of the modern steel plants in Australia, in Newcastle, and then later on in the 1920s in Wollongong. So, I mean, these were some of the early uses of coal, which a lot of Australians probably not that aware of, but it's become very critical to the whole history of the country and the way we've been able to develop and the wealth we see today.
It's interesting. Australia's economy was, I mean, in my very early childhood, but you know, in the earlier to mid part of the 20th century, you talk about Australia riding on the sheep's back. We were a wool producing nation, a wool exporting nation, and that was where our prosperity was derived from. And then, of course, you have the importance of iron ore to our economy in the latter part of the 20th century into the early 21st century. Coal, I mean, it's maligned, of course, because of concerns about emissions from power generation and the effect they have on global warming and the efforts to drive towards net zero these days. But I mean, we don't talk so much about Australia riding on the fact that we were so blessed to have so much coal, brown and black coal, and that this was exploited, it was mined, it was used for, as you've just described, so many really important uses for getting around the country, for powering our towns and cities, that it was used from the get-go, even from the convict era. So why are we quiet about coal, do you think, and the importance of coal to our prosperity?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm not sure of the answer to that one. You're right. I mean, they were school kids. I can remember many, many years ago, learning the importance of the wool industry and other agricultural commodities too, like wheat and other cereals and so on, sugar. Maybe we've taken coal for granted for too long, and maybe also, there were always, quite negative aspects to coal when we think of the poor safety record over a long period of time and the deaths and injuries. More recently, as you said, the argument over climate change and emissions of CO2. But yeah, I think it is unfortunate that a lot of Australians just don't really understand the role that coal has played, and perhaps the difficulty we're going to experience in weaning ourselves off coal over the next couple of decades.
Yeah. Look, we'll get on to the working conditions in the coal mines a bit later, but you're right, in terms of its community impact, they were some pretty horrifying statistics of mortalities of coal miners in Australia, even versus the mortality of miners in countries like the United Kingdom. So tell me, Denis, about the beginnings of our coal industry. I mean, I guess I'd just like to reflect on the fact that Australia has the world's third largest coal reserves, and it ranks fourth for black coal and second for brown coal in terms of economic resources. So, we have a lot of coal in Australia, and the new settlers in the late 18th century, they found it, didn't they? Very, very quickly. It's amazing.
They did.
Yeah.
They did. So the first discoveries were in the 1790s. It's a bit hard to tell from when these things are described, looking back many, many years later, but probably near Lake Macquarie, on one of the beaches near Lake Macquarie, between Lake Macquarie and Newcastle. And it was thought that the Aboriginal people in that area actually used coal for possibly cooking, possibly heating. And there was an Aboriginal name, I think, for the area. I think it's something like Nikin, which is place of coal. And there was another a group coming back from being shipwrecked down south, came back along the New South Wales coast and found coal near Wollongong. I think it was there on the beach at Coalcliff. And they reported this back to the authorities in Sydney, and George Bass was sent down there to have a look. And yes, he discovered what they thought was coal, and they could see it in the cliffs above. And those cliffs above were the coal seams which run right through from the coast under the Blue Mountains and through the Great Dividing Range in parts. So that was the initial discovery. The first coal, in fact, the first miner in the colony, a guy called John Platt, who was a convict. He and a party, initially they were trying to find coal around Sydney near the Georges River, but were unsuccessful. But then they were sent up to the area which was called the Hunter River in those days, and they found good coal, and they started mining in about 1798, as you mentioned before. Early mining was pretty unsuccessful, very primitive, and it was formally discontinued, although there were few, I think, groups who got in and hacked a bit of coal out of the coal seams and sent it back to Sydney. But from 1804, you had mining restarting, And from that time, Newcastle became a permanent settlement. So they were the early days, and the mining continued under government ownership in Newcastle until the 1920s, when the Australian Agricultural Company, which still exists, I think it's still listed on the stock exchange now, a beef producer. We had the first privatisation, I think, in Australia, where the government mines were unloaded onto a private company, AACo, which had amongst its esteemed directors many of the leading lights in London.
Yes, I can imagine.
Fascinating country.
The early years of the coal industry in the sort of convict era of the late 18th century, Denis, I mean, the convict labour would have been incredibly important for the development of the industry. Can you tell me what was the effect of relying so heavily on convict labour? Because were there a lot of, I guess, early indications that this industry would be rife with industrial strife as it became?
That's interesting. In fact, no, the link between convicts and industrial strife is really not there. The convicts were used, for example, when AACo was given the leases in Newcastle to run the mines. I think it started in about 1831, its own operations there. It was assigned in the 1830s a couple of hundred convicts. But by the late 1840s, one statistic I remember, there were only 4 convicts out of 100 or 200 people working with the company. There were 40 or 50 who had what was called a ticket of leave. They were sort of conditional parole or conditional pardon. The rest were miners who'd been recruited from a lot from the UK. The industrial strife really started in the 1850s and 1860s with the great proportion of the miners, of course, at that time, they'd been recruited from Cornwall, from Scotland, from areas in the north of England, various parts of Britain. And they brought with them, plus the managers were the same. They were Brits. So the people who came, the managers and the miners, all brought with them the history, the conflicts, the hates, the loves, you name it. It was there. So we had the recipe for continuation of industrial problems in Australia.
Yeah, but also a very good example of skilled migration, of course, where we were seeking skilled miners from the mining areas of the United Kingdom. It's really interesting to read about how coal was exported almost immediately throughout the British Empire, really. There's this idea that Australia only discovered Asia in the 1970s with, Whitlam going to China and the like, and then Paul Keating and APEC and Hawke in APEC. But, this is quite clearly rebutted when you see that we were already possibly by the time of 1799 exporting to Bengal. Can you talk about how interconnected Australia became through the export of coal with Asia and the Pacific in the 19th and early 20th centuries?
Yeah. I'm not sure how interconnected we were, Georgina. I think it's one thing exporting commodities to another country. I think the real connections have been have been post-war. If you look at, say, the early 1900s, most of our exports were to Britain or the other Commonwealth countries. And, there were much closer links because of our history with the UK and New Zealand and other countries in the Commonwealth. So, yes, for the times, there were quite substantial coal exports and other exports into Asia, but I don't know how deep our links were really in those days.
It's incredible to see by 1900, New South Wales was exporting 1.4 million tonnes of coal, and their major markets were Chile, the US West Coast, New Zealand, Indonesia, and Hawaii, which at that time was called the Sandwich Islands. I never knew that. They were the major destinations for our coal, and then Pacific and Asian countries also bought small quantities of our coal. So I think as far back as 1860, 25% of New South Wales coal was being exported, which is incredible.
Yeah, it was important. I don't downplay the role of coal there. I think a lot of the trade, although there was, I can remember one of the leading lights in Australia, one of the Brown family, did a lot of work in developing markets. But I think a lot of the coal exports from Australia were influenced by what was happening in London. And with ships being sent to Australia, I think the typical ship was from west to east because of prevailing winds. So the companies in London, a lot of the time, would have been the ones who would probably found the markets in some of these other countries, be it Chile or be it in Asia and so on. So it was a fascinating time. But yeah, I mean, we did have those links. So it's not just the recent years where we've discovered Asia, if you like. Yeah.
Mm. So one of the blights of coal is, of course, the way it was mined and the conditions that the miners faced. And I mean, there's many a horrific tale of conditions of coal miners in the UK over its history, and have been written about in fictional accounts as well as non-fiction accounts. But what was the situation here in Australia, particularly through the 19th century, for a coal miner?
Mm. Well, the first piece of legislation in terms of mine safety was not until 1854, and it was a whole one page, unlike the Acts of the day. And it allowed for the government to appoint an examiner of coal mines, and I think it provided for companies to produce mine plans. So you had really one person. It didn't have much of an effect. But as time went on in the 1860s and later, there was more legislation brought in, and a lot of that was influenced by what was happening in the UK, which had a major Royal Commission in the 1840s, which found horrific. I don't think a lot of the average people in Britain were aware of the conditions in the mines there, with very young children working in the mines. It was just incredible. That led to some legislation in the UK, which I think finally happened in the 1850s. And so you saw in Australia, we followed on with legislation. But we still had huge problems. I mean, in the 1880s, I think it was about 1888, the Bulli mine near Wollongong, we had a huge explosion with 80 or so men and boys killed. 1902, Australia's worst industrial accident of any industry, Mount Kemmler in Wollongong, about 250 men and boys killed. These were gas explosions, so just horrific. And so it's taken many, many years since then, and even after World War II. I think it took until the 1990s, which is when I was quite involved for, again, I mean, I'm not saying there was nothing happened before, but the industry really and governments bit the bullet and toughen up the legislation and requirements on companies. So it's been very much an evolving process, a slow process. The industry now is generally, I mean, it's not perfect, it's pretty safe. Most companies, I think, are doing a great job. We do hear problems from time to time, but it's a big change from even 30 years ago that we see now. So the industry, I think, recognises that history's there, can't do anything about it now, but we've come a long way, that's for sure.
Yeah, I mean, it is tragic to look at these death figures, death rates for the New South Wales coal industry between 1880 and 1899 that had an average of 2.3 deaths per year for every 1,000 men employed. And in Queensland, the death rate, the same period, 1890 to 1899, was 2.5 deaths for every 1,000 employed. And in the same period for Great Britain and Ireland, the average was 1.7 deaths. So Australian mining at the time was more dangerous than in Great Britain and Ireland, which is
that's right, yes.
is really distressing to read. Obviously, the key locations for the development of our coal mining industry, I mean, it was across Australia, but the key areas of activity, Newcastle, the Illawarra, Lithgow in New South Wales, these really became sort of epicentres of economic but also political importance to the colony of New South Wales. Can you talk about how coal helped shape the political cultures of the places where it was thriving?
Yeah, that's an interesting one. I mean, Newcastle, the Hunter Valley, Lithgow, Wollongong, the Illawarra, they're largely Labor electorate in those areas, and they've had we do see a few non-Labor MPs elected, but that's not the general rule. And so I know from my time in the industry some years ago now, but back in the 1990s when there was a push, in the late 80s, 1990s, when there was a push to achieve some major reforms in things like the Joint Coal Board and the Coal Industry Tribunal, the Labor politicians weren't keen on those sort of reforms. And of course, they had close links to the main union, the Miners' Federation, which later became part of the CFMEU. And so it was a tremendous struggle to try and get governments at state or federal level to bite the bullet and in the case of the Joint Coal Board, to first reform it and then to do away with it. And same with the Coal Industry Tribunal, which came into being just in the post-war years as part of the Joint Coal Board legislation. And it existed until the 1990s. And again, the coal industry wasn't left with nothing, but it was just absorbed into the mainstream industrial relations system, which is what the industry had been arguing for many years. So that was just an indication of the importance and the influence of the main union, Miners' Federation, and the MPs which came from those areas in the way the industry developed, the way it was regulated. So, yeah.
You were describing before, Denis, that the coal miners coming from Cornwall and other parts of the UK who brought with them traditions of trade unionism and, collective bargaining, organisation, that the areas then where they were working in Australia also were influenced by those traditions. So it'd be interesting to hear more about how the trade unions and their industrial activities developed strongly in those areas.
Okay. Well, the trade unions in New South Wales, Queensland a little bit later, but the trade unions in the coal industry go back really to the late 1850s, 1860s. Initially, there were some, I'm trying to think what the name was. They weren't lodges in those days. There were groups in the coal industry which weren't industrial bodies, but they were there to help the miners with more like friendly societies, I guess you could say. But they developed into the branches, or as they were called, still called the lodges. And so really in the 1860s, you see the unions starting to flex their muscles, the employers also starting to look to try and cooperate and get together. So they were the early days, and it's not as if the miners were the ones who caused all the problems. I'm sure they would say the employers were hopeless, or that they couldn't negotiate with them and so on. So it's always this argument between employers and the employees. So those managers, the senior managers and the company directors, I mean, they were the ones who also came from Britain largely, and
they all knew each other, really.
They probably did. Yeah.
They were used to the to and fro. Coal was obviously very important for electricity generation, for power generation. And I mean, it still is today. I think it's something like 60% of our energy at the moment is produced by coal. So while we focus very heavily on renewables in our media commentary, the reality is that more than half the energy in Australia is generated from the coal industry. But tell me, how intimately was the development of our coal industry to the growth of electricity in Australia?
Well, electricity, as I mentioned earlier, really started to take off from the years around Federation and just after. In Sydney, for example, you had one of the first major power stations built came on stream in I think it was about 1898. The Ultimo Power Station, which became the Powerhouse Museum, which is currently being renovated, supposedly. That was only a few years after, in about 1901, 1904, somewhere in that period of time. So that was the start of the more modern power stations. Later on, of course, you had State Electricity Commission in Victoria in the 1920s under John Monash, and developing there. In Queensland, again, probably a little later because the population was so small in those years. But coal was, we had no other energy source in those days. Perhaps a lot of Australians don't understand this either, but it wasn't until the post-war years, really, the 60s and beyond, that where we had oil in Australia, where we had gas. We didn't have the options. We had, apart from Tasmania and the Snowy Mountains, we had pretty limited hydro resources in Australia. And so coal was the one commodity we had in abundance, and it was the thing we needed to rely on to actually see the electricity industry grow.
And Denis, was it relatively cheap?
Look, I'm not sure how it was cheap or expensive. I think if we look more into the post-war years, and particularly once some of the big new power stations were developed in Australia, I'm talking of Liddell in New South Wales, Bayswater, Eraring, which was of 1970s, 1980s. In Victoria, you have Loy Yang and so on. These were much bigger and much more efficient. I think where certainly the cost of coal came into prominence was probably in the 50s and then the 60s, when aluminium producers from overseas were looking to find, because they knew we had the coal, but they were looking for fairly cheap power. And in New South Wales, certainly the first major smelter was in Kurri, and I think set up in the 60s or the 70s. And they were able to negotiate a very favourable contract with the Electricity Commission of New South Wales. In Victoria, you had Point Henry, aluminium smelter in those early years. Bell Bay, which was already up and running in Tasmania, was a bit different because it relied on hydropower, which is very cheap. But that's certainly the growth of the aluminium industry in the 60s through to the 80s relied on cheap power from coal. And we're seeing now that the power prices are rising. Some of those smelters are in danger of folding, which is sad. Yeah.
Denis, the phenomenon of the early coal industry, I mean, really through to even the middle of the 20th century, was that the coal mines were state-owned. And there's this sort of sense that the coal industry was almost as socialist as it was in Britain. Is that your sense when you come?
No, it was a much more mixed scene here, Georgina. Of course, in Britain, I mean, just after the war, 1946 was it? An act was passed to nationalise the coal industry, and some associated assets which companies had, like brickworks and some railway sidings and so on. A massive undertaking, something like 900 collieries over the next couple of years when the British Coal Board started to operate were transferred into government ownership. Australia was never like that. There were, back in the pre-First World War years into World War One, there were moves in Queensland and New South Wales for government-owned coal mines, and the state mine in Lithgow in New South Wales got up and running in the 20s. A couple of mines in Queensland were earlier than that. The Queensland state coal mines were never very successful. Some of the mines, were certainly loss-making. And one of the mines, I think, up in Collinsville in North Queensland, that actually operated until the 1960s when it was transferred into private ownership. In New South Wales, if you look at the post-World War II era, we certainly had a huge government involvement in the industry. The Joint Coal Board, which was set up after the Second World War, in the 50s, that became one of the leading, I think next to BHP and its subsidiaries, it was the leading coal producer through the collieries it established. There was also another body called the State Coal Mines Control Authority, which was set up to develop coal mines to service the power stations. Those mines, in due course, became two separate subsidiaries under the Electricity Commission. So over time, the Joint Coal Board mines closed or were phased out. The Electricity Commission mines were privatised in the 1990s, and that was largely the end of government coal mines. So certainly in New South Wales, except for that early post-war World War II era, the industry has been dominated by private companies, companies like BHP, which goes way back, and many others. But they played an important role, successful in part not so successful. I don't think any governments in Australia now would be looking to, even apart from the controversy over coal mines, I don't think they would look to start their own mines these days.
No, I suspect not. But it was interesting in the early 20th century, the unions were calling for the full nationalisation of the industry, and the New South Wales Labor government, when it was establishing those state-owned mines prior to World War II, they were established under the pretense that it was essential to protect the railway supplies from potential industrial disputes. So there was this concern around workplace strife and the impact of strikes on Australia's security. So coming to the mining strikes during the World Wars, how controversial were these strikes in Australia at the time?
Well, I think they were very controversial, and say this was particularly the case in World War II, when you had a lot of industrial disputes in the coal industry and on the water side. And the unions, of course, in both of those industries led by communists, which was a factor in it, I think, not the only factor. And a big proportion of the potential output of the coal industry was lost in those years. During the war, we were desperate for more coal, but we couldn't produce it because of the strikes and other problems. So, and that continued after the end of the war, unfortunately. People wanted to get back to a normal life, people having families, the baby boom was starting in 1946 onwards, but coal was one of the restraints. And so post-war development of Australia was held back. One of the reasons was we couldn't produce enough coal. We probably couldn't produce enough steel because it relied on coal. It was a very controversial era, yeah.
I mean, you think of the sentiments driving these strikes during World War I, when there were several of them, and then, of course, in World War II, as you've just described. I mean, what was in the minds of the miners, the striking miners, that they would do this and obviously potentially impact the war efforts of Australia and endanger the lives of Australian soldiers overseas?
Yeah, it's a tough one. I mean, there are different views on that, and I'd have to have a look and dig in one of my books just to check some of the references I've got there. But one of the issues was back in the 30s, in the country, the leaders of the Miners' Federation were communists, and they made no bones about the fact that they wanted to achieve their aims, better conditions, more pay and so on, through direct action. They didn't want industrial tribunals to get in the way. And, Menzies confronted this problem in the late 1930s and early 40s. I remember there was one story where he went up to Kurri Kurri near Newcastle, and there was a meeting of about 3,000 locals, and he was trying to convince them about the need to help the war effort and so on. And they passed a resolution basically repudiating everything he said. And they were determined to get their way through direct action. And that continued under Curtin, who became very frustrated, and under Chifley. And, of course, led eventually to the strike in 1949, the famous strike when the army was sent in. So the motivation of the miners is hard to know, exactly what went on. I think there are probably different motivations. Some of it, there was one, remember Alan Walker, the Reverend Alan Walker, who became the leader of the Uniting Church in Australia for many years. When he was very young, he was doing, I think it was a master's degree, and he spent a year or two in Cessnock, living amongst the people. Cessnock was a mining town. And he came out, he produced a short paper on that as part of his thesis, I think it was. And he really felt that the history of the mining industry, going back to the 20s, the Great Depression, the 1930s, the old system of contract mining where you didn't know from one day to the next whether you had work the next day. It was called intermittency. He felt that all of these things combined to produce a certain mindset in a lot of the people, a lot of the families and the miners. But it's difficult to understand what the driver was in some cases. Yeah.
I mean, if you think of it in raw numbers, in 1942, so it's the height of World War II, Australia's facing existential threat from Japan. Around 13% of the coal industry's production was lost because of the effects of strikes and absenteeism. And when Menzies was confronting those miners in the major strike in 1940, I think that the Federation, the National Secretary, Charles Orr, who was a communist and a self-professed communist, he said when Menzies was trying to appeal to the miners' sense of patriotism and stand down, we have one more now and it looks like we'll have another. I mean, he was hell-bent on continuing this fight and to bring down the system. It's hard to imagine that they were not persuaded at least by some sense of patriotism and being part of a broader war effort. But as you say, they had strong communist views and we were trying to prosecute that through industrial action. Can you tell me about this 1949 strike where it got so bad that the army had to be sent in?
Okay, well, if you go to, I think it was 1948, when there was major rationing of coal, real shortages, and industries like steel and major users were cut back by 20 or 30% on what they'd asked for. Big strikes, no progress, the union still wanting direct action to be the solution. And I think if you then go into 1949, there was a major case before the tribunal about wages. That wasn't resolved. There were 5 of the mining leaders, the very senior Miners' Federation leaders, were actually jailed because I think the government required them not to pay any money to strike breakers, and but they wouldn't tell the government where their funds were, so they were jailed. And then finally, Ben Chifley in those days, he was determined not to give in to the miners, and I think it just got to the stage where, the government decided, well, what's going to break this? So they called in the army. The army only came in to operate some of the machinery in open cut mines, and it produced, I think, over a short period of time, about 5 weeks, 100,000 tonnes, which is not a lot of coal in the scheme of things. Initially in Queensland, there started to be some reaction against the union leaders, and so you started to get a return to work in Queensland. So the whole thing folded fairly quickly. Workers went back to work in a fairly short period of time. A lot of the people, of course, the miners probably never forgave Chifley for that. I'm sure that lingered for many, many years. So I think at the end of the day, it was Chifley saying, look, I'm not going to give in. What's the next step we could take? We'll send the army in. They were even talking about sending the army into underground mines, which I doubt whether that would have happened. There'd be too much danger, and you need some very substantial training, I think. Yeah, so it's lived on in industrial relations folklore now, that famous strike. But it was fairly short, really, and didn't produce a lot of coal.
Didn't produce a lot of coal, but has lived on in the industrial relations history. And, of course, in terms of the political history, 1949 was the year when the Labor Chifley government fell to the new Liberal government of Bob Menzies. Yeah. And you've got to wonder whether this type of industrial action and the fact that, it was so bad the army had to be sent in, that it contributed to a sense that really under Chifley things were going a bit out of control. He was wanting to nationalise the banks, and the coal industry was under the grip of these very ardent communist miners' federation activists, trade unionists, and so we needed to give Menzies and his new Liberals a go.
That's right.
We're getting to the end of our conversation, Denis. The commerce agreement with Japan, which was signed in 1957, which I spoke about in the introduction, a landmark agreement 12 years after the end of World War II, where Japan had been our aggressor. Incredible political leadership on the part of Blackjack McEwen, of course, the part of the Menzies government. This was important not just for Australia and its ability to really engage in serious exports to Japan, but for Japan's own industrialisation. And through the 60s, 70s and 80s, you see Japan rapidly industrialising, and on the back of what Australia was sending it. Was this 57 Commerce Agreement, do you think, the real cause of coal exports in the 60s really flourishing for Australia, or were there other factors at play?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. As you would know, Georgina, the agreement itself, from Australia's point of view, was about getting more of our primary products into Japan, wool, wheat, sugar, those sorts of things. And from the Japanese point of view, getting more of their manufactured goods into Australia. And there was significant resistance in Australia from the ALP, Doc Evatt, and some of the manufacturing groups also opposed it. But to their credit, it was signed in 57. So it had nothing to do at that stage with minerals. But it was in 1958, after that was signed. I think there might have, it's hard to know whether there's any direct link, but certainly we see the Japanese coming to Australia. There was a senior coal delegation came to Australia in 58, and that led fairly quickly to, although there had been a small amount of coal sold between Australia and Japan in the 50s, it led fairly quickly to some substantial coal contracts for steel coal, metallurgical coal from the Wollongong area miners. And then in the 60s, of course, you saw the development of the industry in the Bowen Basin in Queensland, initially with Tees, the local company, Utah, which became BHP later on, and Mitsui from Japan, all very critical in the early development of the Bowen Basin. So I think, as John Howard put it in his book on the Menzies era, it basically opened the door to the relationships. And that was a time when Britain was about to go into the European community, and we had to start looking at weaning ourselves off the British market. He said, without that treaty and the relationships it fostered between Australia and Japan, it would have been difficult to see Australia more successfully negotiating the move away from Britain. So it laid the groundwork, I think, although it didn't have anything to do with the coal or minerals. It laid the groundwork for some much closer relationships between Australia and Japan. So a major treaty, that one, yes.
And even today, our key export destinations for our coal are Japan, South Korea, Taiwan and India. So Japan still absolutely needs our coal, despite the move away from coal for power generation. It's still essential in the production of steel, and it supports over 40,000 direct jobs in Australia, and they're in the regional economies where there aren't often a diversity of jobs available. So to turn off a coal mine, to close it down, really closes down communities. So
yes.
With all that in mind, Denis, and looking at the over 200-year history of this industry, what is your assessment for the industry's future?
Well, I think coal's going to be around for a little while yet, I think, that's for sure. If we look at probably the two major components, metallurgical coal, largely for the steel industry, and thermal or steaming coal largely for power generation. Metallurgical coal is going to continue for quite a while yet, and Australia is the major producer and supplier of quality metallurgical coal worldwide. We hear a lot of talk about green steel, and that presumably would have to rely on something like hydrogen to replace coal. That doesn't seem to be going anywhere fast. I mean, the problem with hydrogen is it's very, very expensive to produce. You need to split water into hydrogen and oxygen, and that requires a lot of energy, and therefore it's very costly. So green steel, I'm not sure, how quickly we're going to see any progress on that. So the traditional blast furnaces, which require iron ore plus metallurgical coal and some other coals which can be fed in, I think they're going to be around for a long time. And China may have reached the peak of its steel production. We've got countries like India, which are growing very fast. They're never going to produce as much as China. So I'm fairly confident about metallurgical coal for quite some time. Thermal coal, a lot of the Western countries, particularly in Europe, have moved away from thermal coal, and so we don't see little, if any, produced in Europe, and not a lot of power generation from coal. Or there may be some signs that that's coming back a little bit. But in Asia, a lot of countries like Vietnam, Philippines, they're looking to increase their coal consumption. I think Japan's going to have its coal-fired power stations around for some time because it doesn't have its domestic resources. It has to rely on imported coal, imported uranium, imported gas, and so it tries to have a spread of those energy sources. In Australia, I think we'll continue to see coal-fired power stations close. Eraring now has been extended until early 1929, but it's a power station in the up near Newcastle, which produces almost 3,000 megawatts. And when that closes, perhaps in 29, I hope we don't have major problems here. But we've got other ageing power stations here and in Victoria, and less so in Queensland. They're much younger. Loy Yang in Victoria, how long is that going to continue to burn brown coal and produce all the power it does? So I'm not too sure about Australia's use of coal. In my book, the one on the more recent era, I talk about all the coal-fired power stations in Australia perhaps closing down by 2040, perhaps before. I think we're going to see more coal-fired power stations' lives extended. How long you can continue to do that and how long they remain reliable and fairly efficient, I don't know. But one of the things that worries me about the move to renewables is that we may come a time in 5 years' time or 10 years' time where quite a few of these large power stations, coal-fired power stations, have closed down. And we're finding that perhaps renewables plus some pumped hydro, with the renewables dominated by solar and wind, perhaps they're not going to be able to do the job. Perhaps we need to look at uranium and nuclear power after all. So I think one of the first things I'd like to see happen is the ban on the use of uranium and power generation is lifted. And we start as a country to have a real adult discussion about that. We may have to rely on nuclear power as we go down the track if we're going to continue to want to reduce our emissions. That may be the only way to do it economically and realistically. So coal, yes, it'll be around for a long while. The export markets will be there, perhaps not as large as they are now. Domestically, it's much more uncertain. So, yeah.
Well, thank you so much for that, Denis Porter. A really important history of an essential commodity to the development of Australia. And thank you so much for telling us all about it.
Thanks, Georgina. It's been a pleasure.
That's it for this week's episode of Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute. Please make sure to subscribe and catch up on our latest online content on our website or on Twitter, LinkedIn or Facebook.